Hi, my name is Trevor Paulson, and in this video we're going to be talking about training principles. Specifically, we're going to be talking about what training principles are and how you can use training principles to enhance the programs you create for your clients. So the first question is, why training principles? And if we look at training, one of the things you might notice is there are a lot of different ways you can train. For example, you could focus on CrossFit style training or powerlifting or strongman. You could focus on yoga or Pilates. You could do running or walking or hiking or swimming or cycling. The methods almost seem endless when you really take a second to step back and look at all the potential options. And so when you're trying to pick the methods you want to use with your client or for yourself, it's important to understand what the principles are so that you can pick appropriate methods. And there's a really great quote on this. And essentially what the quote says is that if we look at methods, there are a million and then some, but principles are few. The person who grasps principles is able to choose his own methods. However, the person who chooses methods while ignoring principles is sure to have trouble. And what this does is it really highlights the idea that while yes, there are a lot of different ways to train and there are a lot of different methods you can employ with your clients or with yourself, if you don't understand the principles behind these trainings, you can't select them and you can't use them in the appropriate way to get your desired result. And so that's what we're going to be doing, is picking apart the few training principles that we have tons of data and tons of information on why they're effective. Our first principle is called the SAID principle. And what this principle is specific adaptations to imposed demands. And what this means is when you have a stressor in your environment, what you change or how you adapt to that stressor is specific to the type of stress it is. So for example, if you went outside in the summer, you would get a very different adaptation than if you went outside in the winter. Because what helps you in one environment doesn't help you in another. And so when we're talking about training and we want to make you stronger or we want to make you faster or we want to increase your endurance, we need to match what type of stressor we're putting on the body to get the appropriate adaptation. So if I wanted you to be very strong, I would want to load up the weights near your maximum value. If, however, I wanted to focus on endurance, I would use a lower amount of weight and I would extend how long you're doing that training to cause the appropriate adaptation. And so the SAID principle really helps us understand how to match the type of stressor we're putting on the body with the adaptation we want to occur. The next principle is the principle of progressive overload. And to explain this principle, I like to start with the story of Milo. Now, Milo lived in ancient Greece, and he was a world-famous wrestler and strongman. He won numerous competitions and titles for being the strongest and the greatest wrestler. And so a lot of people came to Milo and asked him how he grew so strong. And anytime people would ask Milo about his strength, Milo would tell a story from his childhood. Now, Milo's father had a lot of livestock. And one year, there was this calf born that was unable to walk due to some genetic problem. And Milo looked up at his dad and asked his father what would happen to this calf since it couldn't walk out into the field to eat. And Milo's father looked at him and told him that because it couldn't walk out to the field, he was going to have to kill the calf to put it out of its misery. Now, this was very upsetting to Milo. And Milo actually made a deal with his father that every single day he would carry the calf into the field so that it could eat and then bring it back at nighttime. And reluctantly, Milo's father agreed. And so the first day came, Milo picked up the calf onto his shoulders and carried it out into the field. He put it down, the calf ate, and then he picked it back up and carried it home. And Milo did this day in and day out for months. Now, if you're familiar with baby calves, as they eat, they tend to grow and they get bigger and heavier. And one of the ways Milo developed his strength was day in and day out by carrying a calf that's slowly getting bigger and slowly getting heavier. his body had to adapt, he had to get stronger. Now, if I went out into a field and tried to pick up a full-grown bull, I would have a hell of a time with it because I'm not strong enough there. Yet, by the end of the story, Milo was able to pick up his full-grown bull and carry it back and forth from the field. And so the idea behind Milo, and there have certainly been people that have questioned the veracity of this claim and whether or not it's true, but on a base level, we can understand that if we're trying to develop strength or we're trying to adapt to a particular situation, we're going to do much better if it's a slow, steady adaptation, gradually increasing over time, versus all out trying to do it in a day or two. And that's really what this principle is all about. It's how we slowly add weight, or we slowly make the challenge more difficult as you start getting more fit, as you become more strong. Now, tied to this idea is what we call the dose-response relationship. And if you've ever taken medicine before, you'll notice that on the back of the bottle, it'll tell you how much you should take. And this is really important because with exercise or with medicine, if you don't have enough of a substance, it cannot cause an adaptation, or it cannot cause a change. There's a minimum effective dose for medicine for you to take for it to actually have any effects in the body. It's basically a minimum threshold. The same is true with exercise. If I did one push-up this morning and then I didn't do any other training, I'm not going to reach that minimum threshold or that minimum dose to cause an adaptation or to cause a change. At the same time, just like with medicine, if you take too much of something, it can actually cause a lot of different problems and it won't lead to good adaptation, right? If I'm taking medicine and I take 10 times the recommended dose, I could have a whole lot of problems, including toxicities. And with this, we talk about the concept of overtraining. And overtraining is when you're training so much, or you're having too much of a stressor on the body, that your body cannot handle that amount of stress, and it actually leads to a poor adaptation or a maladaptation, where you actually get worse. And so the dose-response relationship is how we identify what's the proper amount to cause a change, but not so much that it causes maladaptive behaviors or maladaptive changes. The last portion then is progressions and regressions. And what progressions are is it's literally just a word of how to make progress. So when I start exercising, maybe I start doing body weight exercise. So I do a body weight squat. Well, as I get stronger, I'm now probably able to handle a more advanced technique. And I could hold a kettlebell in front of me and do a goblet squat. Or as I got stronger, I could do a back squat or even an overhead squat if I was training for enough amount of time. Regressions, on the other hand, or regressing someone, is decreasing the level of difficulty or making the exercise or making the challenge easier. And so if I started with body weight and I was unable to do it, it was too much stress at one time, it was leading to that overtraining or above the effective dose, I can make the exercise easier. So maybe instead of doing a squat, I now have a physio ball behind me, I'm against a wall, and now I'm squatting in a way that all my body weight isn't on my legs. Or I could use an exercise machine like a leg press and decrease the weight where it's less than my body weight. And both of those would be ways of regressing the exercise to making it match the effective dose. The next principle is the principle of variation. So if the principle of progressive overload was the idea that you want to keep a stressor the same and then gradually increase the difficulty of that stressor, the principle of variation states that novel stressors, or changing the type of stress, can actually lead to an enhanced adaptation. And the way I like to explain this principle is think about scary movies. The first time you watched a scary movie, it probably caused a pretty intense stress response. Your heart was beating out of your chest, your pupils were dilated, you jumped at any scary moment. However, if you watch the same scary movie again and again, while it might still kind of creep you out, it's probably not as intense as before. The same thing could be said if you watch a lot of scary movies from the same time frame, or if you watch them on like a movie marathon throughout the day, you'll notice that you don't jump the same way as you would if you watch a scary movie in an isolated context or a movie you've never seen before. And that's really what this idea of variation is by changing the stressor, we can get a greater adaptation. Now, this is going to be very useful for a couple of different things. The first is breaking through a plateau. When you're training and when you're making progress, gradually we want your training to look like this, where it's always increasing, you're always getting stronger, faster, greater endurance. However, sometimes when we're using the principle of progressive overload, we'll go up for a while and then we'll kind of level off and we'll plateau at a certain set point. Using the principle of variation, you can actually disrupt that plateau through a novel stressor and continue that progress on up. And that would be one potential use or one reason why we should care about this principle of variation. Another reason is because it helps to reduce injuries. If you're a baseball player and you want to throw, again, the ball 100 miles an hour, and all you ever do is throw a baseball, you're going to get what's called overuse injuries, because the body is only able to handle so much stress before it starts to break down and start having some maladaptive changes. Whereas if you look at professional baseball players, they don't just throw a baseball to get stronger. They also do weight training. They also do different types of stretching or coordination type drills. Training looks very different and will actually change over the course of a year, so they're not doing the same exact activities thousands upon thousands of times. And so variation can be a really good tool for avoiding overuse injuries that occur when you're doing the same exact thing thousands upon times in a row. There's one thing to keep in mind when talking about variation though, and that's too much variation leads to poor adaptation. And let me give you an example. If you went outside and it was really hot and you started adapting to that and you started changing, and then the next day it was freezing cold, you have a lot of variation there, but the stressor isn't the same long enough to cause an actual adaptation. And this is probably where a lot of beginners make the most mistakes, is they want to constantly be changing the plan, they want to constantly be changing the exercises with their client. Whereas by keeping the stressors the same and keeping the exercises the same for an extended period of time allows them to have better progress. And so just doing variation for variation's sake is not actually an effective way of getting them good results. You need to use progressive overload and then supplement that with variation to help overcome plateaus or to avoid overuse injuries. The next principle is the principle of rest and recovery. And what this principle states is that adaptation does not occur during the activity. It actually occurs afterwards when you're resting and when you're recovering. And this should make sense, right? Because if I was doing a workout where I was training my arms, during that activity, I'm actually getting weaker, right? If you measured my ability to lift those weights at the beginning, I would be able to lift more weight than at the end of my workout. And the reason for that is working out can cause damage and can cause stress to the body. That stress, though, is what stimulates adaptation. And so when you're repairing those muscles, you actually build them back bigger and stronger for the next time. And so if you understand this, that the exercise session or the practice or the game session is actually making you worse, or it's actually causing stress which decreases performance, you would understand that having appropriate rest and recovery is imperative if you want an adaptation to occur. And some people describe this like a bank account. And if you have a lot of money in the bank, you can spend a lot more on your training, you can spend a lot more during games. If, however, you're not eating well, you're not sleeping well, you're not doing things that lead to good rest and recovery, your bank account gets smaller and smaller, and if you keep doing those things, you'll overdraft your bank account and it could lead to something like an injury or a poor adaptation. And so we need to keep in mind when we talk about our principles, for every stressor we place on the body, we need to counteract it with good and effective rest and recovery. The next principle is the principle of individuality. And what this principle does is it helps explain why two people could be on the exact same training plan and get totally different results. One person might increase their muscle mass and increase their strength to a high degree, while the other person might see little to no change whatsoever. And this principle is really important because it helps us to take a training plan and shape it to the person we're working with, rather than having a rigid plan and trying to put the person into that box. Now, the potential explanations for why this works begins with talking about DNA. Now, when you were born, your parents gave you your DNA, and your DNA will have different capabilities that might differ from the average person. For example, there's something called myostatin deficiency. And what myostatin deficiency does is it basically turns off your body's ability to slow down muscle growth. And so if a person had myostatin deficiency, you would see that they would have massive amounts of muscle with very minimal amounts of work. And so if that person was on a training plan, they would see very different results than someone who does not have that same DNA change. Now, this idea can be helpful if we think about it in terms of your genetic ceiling or your genetic limitations. And when you were born, your body had a limit to the types of progress and the types of adaptations that could occur. For example, let's say when I was born, if every single day I trained as hard as possible and took care of my rest and my nutrition and all of that stuff was perfect, maybe my genetic ceiling would be 500 pounds in the squat. Okay, and this could be based on my limb length, right? If I have different limb lengths, it might change how much I'm able to lift. It might be affected by what my mass is. So if I have more muscle mass, I'm probably be able to lift more weight than someone who can't add that muscle mass. All those factors would lead to my genetic ceiling. And when we talk about genetic ceilings, we can talk about the idea that the further away you are from your genetic ceiling, the faster you make progress. So again, if my example was 500 pounds and I begin at 0 pounds, theoretically, halfway point would be 250 pounds. And let's say it took me 2 years to reach that halfway point. Well, after I reach that halfway point, if we then look at the difference between 250 and 500, there's another halfway point there. And so if it took me another 2 years to make that progress, I've now made less progress in 2 years than I did before because I'm approaching that halfway point from my theoretical max. And so if it took me 2 years to make this progress and then 2 for this, every 2 years then I'll be making less and less progress towards my ultimate genetic ceiling. And that's really what we see when we look at training plans. If you look at a beginner, they're going to make progress at a much faster rate than a more experienced person. Adding 50 pounds to your squat is relatively easier for a beginner, and it would be insane if a world level competitor could add 50 pounds to their squat in a year or 2 years. And so the closer you get to that genetic ceiling, the harder it is to get an adaptation, the harder it is to stimulate that change you want to occur. The next aspect that we need to consider when talking about this principle is the idea of training age or overall training experience. If someone has more experience weightlifting, I'm going to pick different exercises, I'm going to pick different strategies that are more advanced than a beginner. In the same way, if I took a beginner program and put an elite level competitor on it, they're probably not going to get a lot of adaptation or stimulation. And what we generally find, and this kind of relates to that idea of genetic ceiling, is that the higher your training age or the higher your experience, the more specific your training has to become to lead to that adaptation. And so a beginner might benefit from doing a lot of different things to kind of build their overall base. An experienced person or a high-level competitor has to really focus on one or two things to get those to continue progressing. And so their training plan needs to be a lot more specific than a beginner's plan. We can also talk about other factors like what sport the person plays or what position or how they play that position. So if I play basketball and specific adaptation to imposed demands tells me I should do X number of things to help basketball players progress and get better, the principle of individuality might explain further how if I want to be a more aggressive defender, I would need different abilities. And so the principle of individuality is understanding who is the person we're working with and what types of adaptations can we occur in them to help them excel in what they want to do well. We can also talk about differences in personality and disposition. How I coach someone might change depending on who they are as an athlete or who they are as a client. So if I know they're high energy, they're really outgoing, I might be more high energy, I might get in their face a little bit more than someone who's a little more introspective, right? Matching your coaching style to the athletes you work with is a really important thing to understand as a coach. And so from a principle of individuality standpoint, if I know that they handle stress really well and they're one of those hardworking people who can deal with any type of stressor, I might program differently than someone who's maybe going through a lot in their personal life. The next principle is the principle of reversibility. And what this principle states is that a lot of our physiological adaptations aren't permanent. And it doesn't make sense for an adaptation to be permanent because if you remember, all adaptation is changing to your environment. And our environments we live in change on a monthly, yearly, or even decade-long basis. And so if you adapted to one environment, but then you could never change it, you wouldn't have high levels of survival. And so if you expose someone to training for 5 years and then they never touch a weight ever again in their life, you'll notice that they'll slowly over years get weaker and weaker as they're no longer exposed to that stressor or that environment. Now, it's also important to recognize that certain physiological abilities will decay or reverse faster than others. So for example, if I did a lot of running and I was training for a marathon, and then I took a week off, I would lose a lot more of my ability to do cardiovascular exercise compared to if I was weight training and then I took a week off of weight training. And the reason for that is cardiovascular abilities need a high level of maintenance. They need you to constantly be using that skill set, otherwise it reverts back very quickly. Strength, on the other hand, doesn't need the same basis because your body recognizes that every single day you might not need high levels of strength. But on the off situation that you do need strength, you better not have gotten rid of it during the lull or the period of inactivity. And so if we understand that different abilities will decay at different rates, what we can then say is that we need to focus on the abilities that decay fastest and keep updating them over time so that they don't go away too quickly. The last piece of the puzzle then is that highly specialized adaptations are usually the first ones to go away. So if you took an Olympic level competitor and let's say a junior high athlete in the same exact sport, and they both took a month off of training, the Olympic level competitor will look much worse than that kid who's just now learning their sport. And the idea is the closer you get to that genetic ceiling, the faster you fall off, right? The more specialized the adaptation, the quicker you'll actually lose it. And so if you're working with high-level athletes, you need to maintain their level of ability so they don't lose it and have to regain it. Now, there is something to be said about the idea of if you lose an ability through reversibility, it's actually easier for you to regain it over time. So if I could bench press 225 pounds and I take a couple months off and then I come back to it and now I can only lift 200, I will get back to 225 much faster than when I first started training to work up to that level. So reversibility, you lose that ability, but sometimes you can actually still have the foundation for building that strength or re-getting it back later on. And we'll talk about this further as we explore some of our concepts of exercise physiology. The next concept is the FIT principle. And the FIT principle helps to explain how we manipulate and how we change our training. And realistically, the FIT principle has to do with 4 main variables. We have our frequency, our intensity, our time, and our type. And we'll go through each of these. So frequency has to do with how often you're engaging in training. So if I train twice a week, my training frequency would be 2 times per week. Now, as I said before with the principle of reversibility, you might need 1 day a week to maintain something, or you might only need 1 day every month to maintain a different ability. So training frequency will depend on whether or not we're trying to maintain a skill, which takes less work, or whether or not we're trying to cause a significant adaptation. Now, it's a misnomer, or it's a bad way of thinking, to assume that increasing training frequency always leads to better results. And a lot of people tend to increase how often they train rather than improve other types of variables and other types of changes. And so don't just think if someone's training 5 days a week, that plan or that program is necessarily better than one plan that focuses on training 3 times a week. It really depends on how that variable ties to the other variables we're going to be talking about. Intensity then has to do with how intense the session is, or what's the resistance or the level of effort. And when we talked before, we talked about strength requiring a high level of intensity, whereas endurance required lower levels of intensity. And so depending on how you're training someone might dictate what level of intensity you're engaged in. Another thing to keep in mind is, again, if we're trying to break through plateaus or apply the principle of progressive overload, we're generally increasing the intensity over time, and as we get stronger, we're able to handle that intensity. So if my maximum capacity to lift weight was 100 pounds, and I wanted to train at 50% intensity, and then the next week I went up to 55% intensity, and then I went up to 60, 65, 70, that's a form of progressive overload, is improving the intensity of a session by increasing how much weight I'm lifting. Another way of increasing intensity is increasing how fast you're engaging in that activity. So if I'm running, the faster I'm running, the more intense it's going to be. Am I doing sprints or am I doing distance work? Right? The time it takes or how long I'm engaged in that task or how quickly I'm moving will dictate how intense of a session it is. Another factor, and this one ties really well with endurance, is how much rest I'm giving myself. If you give yourself less rest in between sets, that's a higher intensity because you haven't fully recovered. And so you're training in a fatigue state. And that can actually be beneficial if you're trying to work on things like endurance or work on technique despite being tired or despite being fatigued. And so intensity is how we ramp up the effort being put forth during a session. Time is the next variable, and time is really good for describing cardiovascular exercise or aerobic activities. How long did you run for? I ran for 30 minutes or I swam for 20 minutes, right? That's how we a lot of times measure a session. However, 30 minutes or 20 minutes might work well for cardiovascular exercise, but it doesn't really tell us a lot about your training for weight training. And so what I like to do for this one is I like to put time/volume. Because realistically, time is just a measure of volume or how much work you're engaged in or how much work you're doing. So in a weight room, typically we're going to measure volume instead of time as sets times reps. So how many repetitions did you engage in and how many repeated bouts of effort did you do across number of sets? And so time/volume is how we track how much you did in a given session. And this, tied with intensity, is going to help us regulate how much stress we're placing on the body. The last one then is type. And type tells us what activities we're engaged in. Are we doing distance running? Are we doing weightlifting? Are we doing stretching? The different types of training will dictate how frequently we should do it, how intense we should do something, and how much volume or time we can engage in versus how much rest we need. And so the type of exercise is also a very important training variable to consider when looking at these. And if we look across the board, you can see that all of these variables are interrelated. If we're doing something for a long duration or a high level of volume, we're going to have to decrease how much intensity we have during that session. Otherwise, we could get an injury or we could totally fatigue ourselves past the point of good adaptation. If I'm doing really intense training days, I probably can't do that 5 or 6 times a week because I'm not giving myself enough time to recover in between sessions. So if it's a high level intensity, I'm probably going to decrease how frequent I'm doing those sessions to let myself recover more in between training days. And so when we look at the FIT principle, we need to keep in mind that changing one variable will have an impact on the other 3. And you can't change one without noticing how it's going to impact or change your other variables. The next principle is the principle of periodization. And what this principle does is it helps to explain how we should approach training from a big picture perspective. Generally, when we create training sessions or when we create exercise plans, we don't do it on a day-to-day basis. We don't train someone on Monday and then make up a new idea on Wednesday for what they should do next. Instead, a good coach will create a training plan, usually months or even years at a time. And each individual session then has a specific goal over that span of time to help you reach your overall main objectives. If we want to define periodization then, we can say that it is the systematic manipulation of training variables across an extended period of time, typically broken down into discrete blocks of training. And let's kind of go through and explain what that means. So periodization is just talking about periods of time and breaking a large chunk of time. So let's say a year of training into smaller blocks so where we can have specific goals that lead to our overall goal. Training variables then are going to be what we talked about in our FIT principle. It's the frequency, the intensity, the time, the volume, the type of exercise we're engaged in, and how we're going to change those over the year to maintain progress and keep you getting results. Usually when we talk about discrete blocks of training, we're going to talk about different goals. And there's a concept called phase potentiation where the first block of training will help you in your second block of training. And the second block of training will build on what that first did and then lead to your third block. So for example, if I was working with someone, almost always I'm going to start with a lower intensity training, maybe focusing on something like endurance, and then over time I'm going to change to maybe strength and or speed. So I go endurance first, then strength, then a speed type training plan to get them faster. And we can get into specific physiological reasons for why this makes sense. But for now, let's just think that instead of trying to make someone faster and doing that every single day, if we focus on the building blocks of how to make someone faster and we break that up into smaller chunks, we can actually help someone get faster a lot quicker because we're not trying to do everything in one training session or in one training week. Now, those are the main principles of training. And if you're going to be creating programs, you need to have a deep understanding of each of them so that you don't violate a training principle and lead to a poor adaptation or to an injury. And as we said before, good training gets people results, it minimizes injury risk, and it's as efficient as possible. And the greater your understanding of what these principles are and how to apply them, the more effective you will be in creating good session plans. If you have any questions, please reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you in my next video.